Thank you for downloading this Council on Foreign Relations video. CFR is an independent national membership organization and nonpartisan research center. For more information, please visit us online at cfr.org.
I want to welcome you. I'm David Kellogg, publisher, Foreign Affairs, and I want to welcome you to this especially timely session of Foreign Affairs Live. I want to say that this is one way that the magazine connects with our readers. We also invite you to become a friend of Foreign Affairs on Facebook and also to follow us at Foreign Affairs _ on Twitter. And this evening, our almost 2,000 Twitter followers were very responsive and submitted some questions for the panel. And the first question will come from one of them. In the meantime, enjoy, and let me introduce our esteemed managing editor, Gideon Rose.
Thank you very much, David. We are very fortunate tonight to have with us Mohsen Milani and Suzanne Maloney. The hallmark of Foreign Affairs is having people who actually know what they're talking about, tell the rest of us what things are actually going on and what we should think about them. And it's delightful to be able, on such a subject of great current practical importance, to be able to pull together an Iran panel with people who really do know what they're talking about. They have extensive bios in your program, but I'll let you read their extensive credentials for yourselves. Let me just point out briefly that Mohsen Milani is professor of politics and chair of the Department of Government and International Affairs at the University of South Florida at Tampa. Suzanne Maloney is a senior fellow at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings. Both of them have written numerous articles and books, the most important of which, of course, are their contributions to foreign affairs, which are available via our website. And just a couple of notes on the courtesies of the meeting tonight. Don't leave early. Don't be disruptive. Turn off all electronic devices. And when we do the Q&A, we're going to have a question back and forth up here for the first half of the session, and then we'll turn it over to questions from you guys. State your name and affiliation, and keep your questions concise and to the point, so we can get as much discussion in as possible. The goal here is pretty straightforward and simple. I want to just have these guys showcase their expertise and tell the rest of us what's going on. So we're going to cover very basic topics: what happened, why it happened, what happens next, and the U.S. role in all this, and what it should be, what it was and what it should be. So why don't I throw it open first to you, Mohsen, and then Suzanne. What just happened in Iran and why?
Well, good evening. Thank you very much, Mr. Rose, for inviting me, and I'm honored to be here. I have no idea what happened, so that should make all of you feel comfortable. I say I have no idea what happened because I was surprised. I was devastatingly surprised. I wasn't expecting to see what I saw. And what we have seen in Iran in the past month or so, I would say, is very unique, unprecedented, at least since the death of Ayatollah Khomeini in 1989. I think it is unique for two reasons. And it's the combination of the two. It is unique because what we have seen in Iran in the past 4 weeks is a combination of a major cleavage within the governing elite, a major division amongst the powerful factions and powerful individuals in the Islamic Republic, coupled with popular discontent on the streets of Iran. So what you see is a combination of a division from the top and popular discontent from below. We have seen division in the Islamic Republic before. In 1987, 86, 87, the heir apparent to Ayatollah Khomeini, Ayatollah Montazeri, was removed from power. That created a major division in the leadership of the Islamic Republic. But there was no street demonstrations. Basically, the disagreement stayed within the corridors of power. Well, that is not the case 4 weeks ago. Because of the allegation of fraud And I use the allegation of fraud because, and again, I'm going to surprise some of you, I really don't know what happened. And it really doesn't matter whether there was fraud or not. What matters is that a significant portion of the Iranian population believes there was fraud. And in politics, as you know better than I do, perception is reality. The perception is that there was fraud, and therefore people got angry and took to the streets. So in short, the short answer to your question, this is an explosive combination of division from top and discontent from below.
Suzanne, what's your take?
I don't disagree with anything that Mohsen has just said. I would maybe highlight three really important developments. First was the election itself, which was dramatic, exciting in a way that all of us who'd been following Iran, who have become sort of attuned to know that Iranian elections are unpredictable and interesting and worth watching over the years, really didn't anticipate this one going as sort of haywire as it did. And really, what happened in the last 10 days or so of the elections was this popular excitement, at least in some corridors of the country. Those of us sitting outside the country can't speak to what extent it infected the entire country, but clearly there was an energy and excitement that no one anticipated that began to coalesce around the candidacy of Mir Hossein Mousavi, a longtime reformist, but someone who'd been out of politics for a good 2 decades. Someone whose political heyday was back in the 1980s when he was a left-wing prime minister who clashed with the current leadership, particularly Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader. During the last 10 days of the election campaign, in part thanks to some very interesting, unprecedented televised debates that were shown on Iranian national TV and featured all kinds of allegations back and forth of corruption and patronage, really explosive stuff in an Iranian context. People became excited in a way that no one anticipated. And so the election itself became this major event. You saw, and you may have seen on YouTube, the protests that were happening, or the parties that were happening in the street in the days before the election that really took over the country, took over Tehran in particular. The second big event, of course, was the election, and the extent to which that I and many others would argue that it was, in fact, rigged. It's not a debate necessarily worth having because I think that, as Mohsen says, the perception that it was rigged was more important than anything else. And perception is reality. The fact that people were willing to believe that, the fact that the victory of Ahmadinejad, or the overwhelming landslide that he claimed was not credible to the Iranian people, is the most salient fact. But it was important because Iranians value that vote, because they take their elections seriously, because they've gone out for 30 years on any number of occasions, gone to the polls, and seen at times their vote actually make a difference. And so this, in and of itself, was a sort of milestone, a catalyst that has brought about, as Mohsen said, a number of very important developments. And so phase 3 was this opposition period. Again, unprecedented. The idea that Iranians en masse would go out into the streets and protest, knowing that their lives and their livelihoods were at risk. We hadn't seen this really since the earliest days of the post-revolutionary chaos. I was in Iran during student protests about 10 years ago, July 1999. It was an epic moment. And yet it really was contained in very small neighborhoods around university dormitories in Tehran, in several other cities. It was a dramatic event for the press and certainly for the Iranian student movement, but it wasn't something that took over the country. This post-election unrest, post-election dissatisfaction with the regime really took over the country, and I think we're still dealing with the after effects, although the dramatic opposition protests have died down.
If you guys were surprised by the outbreak of the turmoil, were you surprised by the fact that the government was ultimately able, it seems, to maintain control? Was there a moment there that it actually seemed like it might be the start of a new revolution or a counter-revolution?
Before I answer your question, let me add something to what you just mentioned, and that is I had a professor many years ago in California who used to tell me that if you know only one country, you know no country, that everything has to be seen in a comparative perspective.
That was obviously a comparative politics person.
Yeah, comparative politics.
My wife's a comparativist.
Yes.
She says the same thing. Right?
So I think it is very important to put what happened in Iran in a comparative perspective, with the exception of Israel, where there is democracy, and perhaps in Turkey. In the rest of the Middle East, you don't see a dispute over elections. As we say in Persian, If you fight over your inheritance, it means your father had something. Now, in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, in Egypt, they don't fight over elections. The fact that we had an electoral dispute in Iran should tell you something about the nature of Iranian society and Iranian politics. Now, going back to the question you asked, yes, I think there was a decisive moment in Iran, and that decisive moment came on Friday, about 2 weeks ago, when Ayatollah Khamenei finally decided to speak. I think at that time people had taken to the streets, and according to the estimates I have heard from good sources within the U.S. government, up to 2 million people had participated in one of the major demonstrations in Tehran. At that time, Ayatollah Khamenei had to make a very important choice to either send a clear signal to the opposition that he is going to suppress them or to come out and compromise. I think he learned from the Shah's days, and he decided not to compromise, and he sent a very clear signal that he is going to solidify his base and he is going to crush the opposition. And I think that is the turning point. Now, that does not mean that the opposition is going to disappear. I don't make that suggestion at all. All I'm saying is that for the short run, he at least was able to bring some degree of stability to the Islamic Republic. And for me, the key element at this time, the decisive element is the role that Ayatollah Hashemi Rafsanjani is going to play. Because by temperament, by his experience, by his position, he is a bridge builder. If he can come out tomorrow in the Friday sermon and propose a solution so that this division can be somewhat repaired, then you're going to see the future of Islamic Republic in one way. On the other hand, if he does not, then I think you're going to see a very different Iran in the coming months and years.
You know, it's funny. I was just reading that from some other guy named Milani in some other lesser magazine who just posted today.
There is only one Milani, and it's the Milani that published with your
and there's only one part. Exactly. Suzanne, do you agree with that analysis about the course of the events? And also, I want you to expound on something you wrote in your piece for us, and when you said that the hardliners today actually have a greater capacity for repression than the Shah's forces did, which perhaps enabled them to actually get through this while maintaining power in a way that the Shah couldn't. Well, that seems curious, given all the things we know about how nasty the Shah was.
Well, a couple of points. I think Mohsen is right. The Khamenei Friday prayer sermon the week after the election was a sort of pronouncement that the opposition moment had ended. The repression, of course, had already begun. The protests were already beginning to wane in numbers as people were viciously beaten on the streets and shot in many cases. So it was confirming what was already happening, that the regime was not prepared to back down, that Ayatollah Khamenei was not interested in a compromise solution, and that he was going to, in fact, take a sort of maximalist position, which was, as he did in the earliest moments of the announcement of Ahmadinejad's quote-unquote landslide, that this was a divide assessment, that this was a new phase of the Islamic Republic, and that is what he signaled, and that is what he spoke about in his Friday prayer sermon. What he also did in that sermon, though, was at least try to make peace a bit with Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, who, of course, has been a seminal figure in Iran since the earliest days of the opposition movement that led to the revolution in '79. He has held many important posts and continues to do so. And he was condemned and insulted and accused of all sorts of crimes during the campaign, as he has been in prior campaigns. But this time it was coming from the sitting president, Ahmadinejad. And Khamenei, I think, saw that as a bridge too far, and so made a point in his Friday prayer sermon initially after the elections of trying to sort of reconcile. And I think the invitation for Rafsanjani to speak tomorrow, while it is important and it will be a conciliatory moment within the Islamic Republic, I think I'm a little bit less optimistic that it may, in fact, reinvigorate the prospects of either the opposition taking hold or a sort of compromise solution by which the moderates, reformers, pragmatists, however you might like to describe them, are somehow brought back into the fold in a very large way. Surely people like Rafsanjani are going to continue to be part of this system, but many of them have been disaffected in a way that I think will be difficult for them to come back in a serious way and make peace with Ahmadinejad, participate in his government, such as it is when it's reconstructed with an inauguration in August, or in any way, I think, do anything other than be sort of elder statesmen who sit back and enjoy the fruits of their success.
I'm going to press you guys a bit on this question of the repressive capacity. I mean, one of the things we see across the Middle East is states that are lousy at most things except staying in power. Does the suppression of the movement represent a sort of an ability of the regime to maintain control regardless of its inability to achieve economic growth or greater freedoms or so forth? And is this something that is, do you now have a system in which they've lost legitimacy, perhaps religious or popular legitimacy, but are still solidly in power like a lot of other countries in the Middle East? Is that what we've now seen?
The word Islamic Republic was chosen by Ayatollah Khomeini because the system we have in Iran consists of two components. There is a Republican component, which represents popular sovereignty, and then there is the Islamic component, which represents, as President Bush used to say, the unelected official. And I'm sorry that I am using his name now for some of you. But I think what we have seen today is a very serious questioning of the Republican component of the Islamic Republic. Now, there are some people who are beginning to even question the Islamic part of it, but I think it is a little bit too early to draw that conclusion. Now, going back to the repressive capability of the regime, I think it is very important to remember that there are some fundamental differences between the Shah's regime and his capability to repress and this regime. Number one, even if we assume that there was fraud in the election, even the most staunch supporters of Mr. Mousavi would admit that at least 35 to 45% of the population voted for Ahmadinejad. So you are talking about the regime that does have some degree of popular support. That's number one. Number two, this regime has shown over and over again that it feels no compunction about using brute force. And as long as a regime is capable of using brute force and can justify it on religious basis, I think they can stay in power. And finally, the repressive capability of the Islamic Republic is significantly more than the Shah ever had. The Shah simply had the Sawak, but these people had the Basijis, they had the Revolutionary Guards, and they have their own intelligence agencies. So I think they do have considerable repressive capability, and I don't think you have seen it all yet. And most importantly, they are willing to use it. And I think they will use it if they have to.
I agree with that entirely. I think the difference in the command structure, the difference in the mobilization of the membership of both the Basij and the Revolutionary Guard is a critical difference between today and 1979. You can look at the 79 revolution in some respects as a collapse of the authority and the political will of the monarchy in the face of a very disciplined and well-mobilized opposition movement. This Islamic Republic is nowhere near a collapse at this stage. I think there are still many of us who wonder to what extent you would see the Basij, the Revolutionary Guard, willing to fire on large crowds in large numbers. We heard many reports, at least through YouTube videos and some of the amateur press that was able to get access when the regular press was forced off the streets during the protests, of security forces who said, please go home. We don't want to have to cause violence, and encouraging the protests to, in fact, leave the streets. So I think there is this real question about the rank and file and to what extent they would be willing to follow orders. But clearly those orders would be given. And I think it's also quite clear that there would be at least a significant willingness to use much greater violence if and when that need arose.
So in political science jargon, are you guys saying that there's much greater political institutionalization of the Islamic Republic than of the Shah's regime?
That as well as greater degree of willingness, and most importantly, the legitimacy of the Islamic Revolution of 1979. They still have that legitimacy of one of the most, if not the most popular revolution of the last 200 years. And that is a significant advantage they have.
And the flip side is the opposition movement to date does not have the sort of coherence, organizational momentum, or leadership that it did in 1979. Obviously, that was a lengthy pre-revolutionary buildup, and I think we're probably in whatever might be the earliest phases of something like that. And you know, for many of us who've watched Iran for a long time and suggested that there was no opposition whatsoever, the fact that you can even talk about an opposition, some skeletal organization that exists, someone was coordinating the protests, the sloganeering, even if to some extent it was chaotic and spontaneous. And the fact that you can now talk about even a symbolic leadership in the person of Mir Hussein Mousavi, those around him, and certainly the reformists who are sitting in prison right now and who are likely to come out much hardened by their experience. So at this point, we don't have the opposition movement that the Shah faced even in the beginning of 1978, but we may find ourselves going down that road at some point.
A couple of centuries ago, in an earlier Middle Eastern crisis, there was a famous line from U.S. foreign policy, Perdicaris alive or Razuli dead. Is this, given what you're saying, is this foreign affairs live and reform movement dead? Is this really a post-mortem on a movement, given everything you're saying, that the what we've seen over the last month is over, it's not coming back, at least for the near to midterm?
I don't think it is over at all, because I don't think it is started with the allegation of electoral fraud. The allegation of the electoral fraud was simply the spark that ignited this movement. I think it would be a huge mistake to consider what has happened in Iran as a beginning at this time of a revolutionary movement. Now, that does not mean that it cannot become a revolutionary movement, say 6 or 7 months from now. But at this time, I would argue that what we have seen in Iran is nothing short of a war of the Islamic Republic against the Islamic Republic itself. Because what we are witnessing is a struggle between two different visions for the Islamic Republic. Take a look at the opposition movement today. Who are the main forces of that opposition movement? Hashemi Rafsanjani, one of the pillars of the Islamic Revolution. Mousavi, the prime minister of Iran during the period of the Reign of Terror. Don't forget, he became Iranian prime minister during the period in which Iranian repression reached its peak. It is the period of the Reign of Terror. And Khatami, former president of the Islamic Republic. Look at the slogans they are using. All of them are reformist slogans. They want to change, they want to reform the Islamic Republic. And the struggle that I just described, the struggle between two different visions, can be summarized in the following way. There is one vision that Mr. Ahmadinejad in many ways represents, and that vision believes that ultimately the supreme leader and the unelected official should reign supreme. Whereas you have Khatami, Rafsanjani, and Mousavi who say, look, we need to give more authority and more power to the Republican component of the Islamic Republic. It is the struggle between these two. Now, that does not mean that we cannot transform this into a revolutionary movement. If the elite within the Islamic Republic fail to resolve their differences, I think there is a very good chance that things can get out of control, and then gradually the movement can transform itself into a revolutionary movement. When the reform movement began against the Shah of Iran in 1977, nobody was talking about overthrowing the Shah's regime, but gradually the movement demanded that. There is, however, one major distinction between the pre-revolutionary time and today. And the distinction is the lack of leadership. In 1978, there was somebody by the name of Ruhollah Khomeini who had established himself as a leader of the Islamic movement. He was expelled from Iran as early as 1963. Now, today, we don't have that kind of leadership. So, the answer to your question, no. I don't think the reform movement is dead, and I don't think you have seen the end of it. I said at the beginning that it is very difficult for me to explain what happened. But I can tell you that what has happened is only the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the Islamic Republic. And I think it is not inaccurate to say that we have seen the sort of death of the Islamic Republic the way we've known it, and we are beginning to see a regeneration of a new Islamic. What kind of configuration it will have, I do not know. But I do know that we cannot go back to June 11th anymore.
So a failed counter-revolution could lead to evolution?
Perhaps.
Suzanne, what do you think comes next?
I would go back to where Mohsen started, which is that we really don't know. I mean, we've been pretty lousy at predicting what's going to happen in Iran with a very consistent track record over the past 30 years. And, however many events and discussions took place in Washington in the run-up to this election, I can attest that none of them predicted that we were going to be facing either a rigged election or a popular uprising or, frankly, the defiance of Mir Hossein Mousavi, which is a factor which may not continue but was very important, I think, in the early moments after the decision to declare a landslide for Ahmadinejad in propelling people out in the streets and giving them a reason to believe that they were not alone in their resentment of what had happened, and that, in fact, that there were people at the top who were equally as outraged by this farce of an election result. So, we are really in a new phase for Iran. What that will be, we don't know. One possible direction is an increasingly militaristic, increasingly hard-line, and increasingly narrow regime, which is focused around Ayatollah Khamenei, around President Ahmadinejad, the very small circles that have supported them over the past 4 years in particular, particularly focused in the Revolutionary Guard and other establishments of the hardline clergy. But we also may be seeing something very different, and that is the revival of the reform movement, the rebirth in a way of its popular mandate, the rebirth of a sort of backbone for the movement that would press for a very different Islamic Republic, perhaps more faithful to the ideals and preferences of the broad base of the revolutionary movement that brought about the Islamic Republic in 1979, which, of course, was very diverse. It included everyone from Maoists to Khomeinists, and has progressively been narrowed in a way that I think no one anticipated at the outset. Mousavi may not be the man to lead that counter-revolution or evolutionary revolution, whatever it may be. I don't think we even know who the leaders will be. But at this stage, I would put my money on that movement because I think in the long term, that is the direction that Iran is going to turn. We may, unfortunately, experience a very tragic and, I think, repressive period before we get there, though.
Okay, let's turn to the U.S. side of all this. I think we've all been appalled by the shallowness of the debate over the American role in all this, at least the people on the panel, presumably. I know you were, Suzanne. I think you might have been, too. But much of it was sort of, enough about me. What do you think of me? What exactly could and should the Obama administration have done differently during the crisis? Would it have mattered if it had done something different, if you think it should have? And what should the Obama administration do next?
I think for the first 2 or 3 weeks, the Obama administration did exactly what a wise and prudent American administration would have done. That is, to consider the dispute and internal Iranian affairs and leave it to the Iranians to settle the dispute. Now, I know there are a lot of people who encouraged President Obama to take the side of the Democrats in Iran. But these are the same people, most of them, who, if this election would have ended up with Mousavi's victory, would have said Mousavi is nothing but a puppet. But because he lost, suddenly for them he symbolizes democracy in Iran, which I don't view it that way. So I think the Obama administration did perfectly fine. They tried to stay above the fray. But at the same time, I think President Obama did something extremely intelligent. And that is, he said that he condemns the use of brute force by the Islamic Republic. And he used a language that was extremely sensitive and smart. Rather than talking about democracy promotion, unfortunately, and I use the word unfortunately with great deal of regret. But unfortunately, democracy, which to me is the best form of government ever devised, has become too closely associated with American plan to overthrow the Islamic Republic. And therefore, it has lost some of its legitimacy, some of its attractiveness. So he was very careful to use a different language, a universal language, the language of human rights. And he basically condemned the violation of human rights by the Islamic Republic. And I think that is a very delicate balance that he maintained, and I congratulate him for being probably, in my judgment, of all the American presidents that have dealt with Iran, and I know there are some people here in this audience who served in one of the previous administration, I think I would give President Obama A+ for his performance so far.
Well, Suzanne, do you agree with that? Is Obama getting good advice on Iran and getting told to say the right things by his staffers?
I think the Obama administration has played it just right, and I actually think the credit goes to the president himself, both from what I understand from my own contacts in the administration, but also, more importantly, from the way that the president has spoken. I agree fully with what Mohsen has said about the problematic nature of sort of coming out forcefully on behalf of an Iranian opposition movement. It sounds great in theory, but in practice it only taints the very people you would want to be helping. And in particular, it would make the second level game, the sort of politics at the elite level, that much more complicated, because it would have seriously undercut Mir Hussein Mousavi as an independent indigenous figure who had his own authenticity and wasn't an American puppet in any way, shape, or form. So I think the administration did it just right. And more importantly, what I liked about what the president did and said was that he actually explained himself, and he treated the American people as sentient human beings who are mature enough to actually get beyond the sort of petty politics of jumping in, and explained the problematic nature of inserting ourselves into this debate. And I recognize that actually must have taken some discipline within the administration, because the nature of bureaucracies is to want to respond, is to want to take an action and want to put the U.S. out there, even in a very benign fashion. And so I think that by coming out the way that he did, by resisting the pressure to take the easy way out and actually explaining himself, the president helped himself. The difficulty, of course, is now, because the pressure is on. The president has indicated that his pronounced strategy of engagement, which he adopted at a time when I think everyone presumed Ahmadinejad would be reelected, and so everyone presumed it would be a very unpleasant, unpalatable Iranian leadership. But he clearly seems prepared to move forward with this strategy. And the difficulty that he's going to be facing at this point is there's a lot of, I think, ambivalence, particularly among the Iranian American community, but just generally among people who've been supporters of engagement for many years, about taking this kind of a step now. I would continue to support the president. I think engagement remains the right strategy for a wide variety of reasons. It's probably less likely to succeed at this stage, but in particular, he's going to be facing some constricted political space at home if he decides to continue to pursue that.
Well, at this point, I think it's a wonderful time to turn it over to Q&A with our audience. As David said, in honor of the role of new media technologies in this crisis, and because we want to jump on any, we're going to have the first question be from our Twitter feed. So Fermina M. asks, almost in a sort of Akbar Ganji-related question for other pieces in FA that I could tout, is the main problem in Iran institutional in terms of the structure of the republic, or is it in the person of Khamenei? If Khamenei dies, will his successor have as much power?
I don't know if he's going to die yet. I don't know if I can answer the question in 2 or 3 minutes whether the problem is structural or not. That would be a subject for a course that I would be more than happy to teach for the whole semester. And by the end of the semester, I can guarantee you I still won't be able to answer it. But if I have to give a short, sort of simplified version of it, I think it would be impossible at this time to predict what happens when Ayatollah Khamenei dies. Please go back to 1987 when Ayatollah Montazeri was removed. Everybody was talking about how Iran is going to go through a civil war, and no one, in my judgment, and I am pretty accurate about this, no one could have predicted that we would have Ayatollah Sheikh al-Islam, not even Ayatollah Khamenei replacing Khomeini. The powerful assembly of experts for leadership got together, and they could not reach a compromise. And eventually, because of intervention of Ayatollah Hashemi Rafsanjani and a few others, they decided to elect Ayatollah Khamenei because he was a good compromise candidate. Now, I have no idea who can replace Ayatollah Khamenei at this time. But I can tell you one thing about Iranian politics. I've been reading and writing about the Islamic Republic for over 2 decades. And I say that with being quite humble, that the minute I say that I know something, then something happens the next day and I have to come back and regret saying what I had just said. In Iran, but this one I can tell you with certainty, in Iran, people who have political ambitions, either for the presidency or for the position of the Vilayat al-Faqih, do not reveal themselves. Because the minute they talk about their ambitions, then they become a target. So I think it would be very difficult at this time to talk about who is going to replace Ayatollah Khamenei. But if when he dies, if the assembly of experts is still under the present leadership, Ayatollah Rafsanjani can play a major role in it because he is the chair of the assembly of experts for leadership.
Suzanne, is it institutional or personal?
Well, I'll put a lot of the blame on Khamenei if Mohsen is unwilling to. But, I think he personally has overseen the increasing consolidation of authority under that office, both with changes that were effected during the constitutional revisions that were done in precedence of his assumption of the role of supreme leader, but also since that time with a number of changes to the office, expansion of its powers. He now wields more sort of power on paper than Ayatollah Khomeini himself did. Khomeini obviously had charisma and an ability to influence the state and its decisions beyond simply his stated powers. But Khamenei, because of his obviously lesser legitimacy, lesser religious credentials, lesser charisma, has found a way to make his office more important, more powerful, and more dominant in the Iranian system. So I think Khamenei is a big part of the problem. Where I would wholeheartedly agree with Mohsen is I think the degree of unpredictability about any kind of succession, in part because Iran has only seen one real succession, and it was guided in part by one of Khomeini's sons, who was alive at the time and very involved with the decision-making. So we really don't know how any institution in Iran would operate. At this point in time, given the depth of the schism among the elite, I'm not convinced that the Islamic Republic or the office of the supreme leader, the system of Vilayat al-Faqih, could actually survive any sort of succession process. So for the health of the Islamic Republic, one would hope that Khamenei takes good care of himself.
And if you don't want the health, you hope that something happens to him. Okay. I'm glad we've been able to bring so much clarity to the situation with you guys bringing in here. At this point, let's turn it over to you guys. Wait for your, right over here first. Microphone, wait for the microphone, state your name and affiliation, and one concise question.
Hi, my name's Eric Gomez. I'm from the State University of New York at Geneseo. And I was wondering if you think that with the crisis in Iran right now, do you think that it would be prudent for the U.S. to try to establish an embassy in Iran right now, or do you think we should wait it out and see what happens before we try to act?
Either one of you.
Let me take advantage of your question and say something about what was just said a minute ago about the problem in Iran. I think the reason why I did not want to get into it is because I don't think the problem is actually with Ayatollah Khamenei, I don't even think it's the problem with the institutions. I think the problem is with the constitution of the Islamic Republic itself. And there is a contradiction, and that contradiction is the attempt to reconcile two things that are really not reconcilable. That is the concept of popular sovereignty and leadership by a religious figure or by a committee of figures. We see the same kind of contradiction in the 1905 Constitution of Iran, where the Constitution gives basic rights to the people, but then says that those rights end if they come into contradiction with the Islamic religion. That is a fundamental problem of the Constitution. And as long as that problem is not addressed, I think we're going to see the same kind of problem we have seen. Now, going back to your question, I think talking about an embassy at this time is too premature, because we've had 30 years of mutual animosity and misunderstanding between the two countries. I think at this time, the best policy is a kind of qualified engagement with the Islamic Republic. The greatest issue for the U.S. in Iran is Iran's nuclear program. We all know that, because that is, if Iran becomes a nuclear power, or if Iran develops the capability to build a nuclear power, that is essentially going to change the balance of power in the Middle East in a way we haven't seen it since the end of World War II. I don't think attacking Iran's nuclear facilities at this time is an option. It's not a very good option, and I'm not very convinced if it is going to do the job. I think regime change, we've tried it, it hasn't worked. It could work in the future, I do not know. But remember, the clock is ticking rather quickly. I think the idea of full invasion of Iran, I leave it up to your imagination after what we did in Iraq. Imagine a country with 4 times the population of Iraq. And sanctions are going to punish the ordinary people. And it's very unlikely that it's going to have the kind of impact you think they have. The only way, and I'm going to advertise foreign affairs now, the only way to proceed is engagement with the Islamic Republic of Iran. At this time, however, because of what has happened in Iran, I think the best policy for the U.S. is to take it easy and let the Iranians make the first move in this path toward engagement and hopefully trying to normalize relationship between Iran and the U.S. Now, by normalize, please understand, I'm not talking about having friendly relationship. I'm not talking about hugging each other. The Soviet Union was an enemy of the United States for many years. China was an enemy of the United States for many years. And then we developed the mechanism, the institutional mechanisms to talk about the disagreements we have. So there is a difference between normalization of relations and a developing friendship relationship. I think I'm in favor of normalizing relations with Iran.
You can get yours in next time, since he went on that one. In the back there, gentleman standing against the wall.
Hi. I'm chairman of the Council of Foreign Relations. All right.
Oh no, I meant I meant Bob Rubin.
I'm a chairman too.
we can bundle them.
All right. My name is Yuvan Bijadar, counselor for the World Bank, but I'm only asking a question based on my own understanding of the issues, not representing the bank. Quick question, Professor Milani. In your understanding of United States strategic security interests in the Middle East and relations with Iran for the past few years, do you think that the United States is fully ready to see regime change in Iran?
Okay, we go from the World Bank to Treasury. Let's bundle. Bob, why don't you get your question in now, too?
Mine is quick, Gideon. Given everything you just said a moment ago with respect to the nuclear potential, what do you think the probability is that Iran will have full-fledged nuclear capability within 5 years?
Okay. Suzanne, why don't you tackle those first, and then we'll go to Mohsen, since he had his take.
I will give an ambiguous answer to a very straightforward question, and that is the answer to your question depends on what you call full-fledged nuclear capability, because many technical experts would say the ability to enrich at the level and at the scope that Iran currently has is a capability beyond what they would like to see Iran have.
I'm aware of that. Let me refine the question. Something that they could turn into a usable nuclear weapon very quickly.
I think all of the estimates on Iran's current capacity and its ability to continue, that if Iran continues to enrich at the pace that it currently does, they will be there within 18 months at minimum. So, you can give or take. Obviously, that number can be extended, but this, to me, underlines the urgency of actually talking to Iran because, as Mohsen has said, we have a wide variety of options. Unfortunately, the latest political tumult in Iran doesn't necessarily change the logic of engagement. It doesn't make regime change a more palatable or more viable option. It certainly doesn't make a military option more viable, and we have a relatively short time frame. The difficulty is that we're going to be dealing with a very unpleasant array of characters. There is almost no prospect that if the opposition that Mohsen and I have talked about has any prospect of succeeding, that's not going to happen in a very short period of time. That's going to be a long, drawn-out, and messy struggle. And so the people that we're going to have to sit across the table from, if we want to deal with the nuclear issue in any way that involves diplomacy, are the people who are sitting in power right now. Khamenei, Ahmadinejad, their nuclear negotiator, Saeed Jalali, who is not a terribly rational human being or a terribly good negotiator for that matter, well known to have gone to his first meeting with Javier Solana and read parts of his dissertation which concerned the Prophet Muhammad's diplomacy. So this is the sort of negotiations that we're going to have to engage in. They're not going to be pleasant. They're not going to be fruitful in the short term. But the only way that we may have to get the Iranians to come to a different understanding of what their security interests are in the region is to actually talk to them frontally. The only time that the Iranians were willing to suspend their enrichment program was when they were engaged in serious negotiations with the Europeans after the 2003 Paris Accord. So it is not an easy mechanism. It is not, in fact, one that is guaranteed to be effective, but I think it is our best prospect. And frankly, given what's happened in Iran, given how uncertain and fluid the situation is, we have to be developing a sort of set of Plan B and Plan C at this point in time. That involves looking at what the sanctions prospects are, and the sanctions will be more likely to be effective, more likely to be universal, or at least rigorous, if we at least engage in a serious effort to bring the Iranians to the table first. And it involves thinking about what options exist beyond there. As both Mohsen and us have said, military option brings you to a very unpleasant place for all of your other interests across the region. And regime change, despite the strength of the opposition at this stage, our ability to promote their prospects is almost nil. So we don't have any other good options, but we're going to have to start looking at the array of interests and the array of possibilities.
What do you think about the argument? You hear some people say, maybe wishful thinking, that because of the loss of legitimacy the regime has suffered during the recent turmoil, it may feel like it wants to improve its legitimacy by making progress on relations with the outside world, and therefore it may be spurred to negotiate more with the United States than it was previously. Do you buy any of that?
Do you mind if I just quickly answer the two important questions that were asked? One about the idea of regime change that the gentleman from the bank asked. I think it is a waste of American taxpayers' money to fund the oppositional movement, Iranian oppositional movement. I say that because I think if there is to be a change in Iran, it has to be from Iranian society itself. If there is one thing we learned from the coup d'etat of 1953, is that when you help, when you provide support for a regime change, at the end of the day, you're going to end up paying a heavy price for it. I think if there is to be change in Iran, let the Iranians manage it, and I think they are capable of doing this, as you saw it in the streets of Iran 2 months ago. Now, regarding the key question about Iran's nuclear capability, I believe, and I say that with admission that I don't have access to classified information, of course, either from the Iranian side or the American side. I'm an academician, and by definition, what I say is accurate. But if I have to make an educated guess, I would say that because I look at Iranian leadership as a rational leadership, By rational, I do not mean necessarily it's something that I would do. You could be rational and wrong. But they are making their decision based on deterrence, based on the dangerous neighborhood they live, and based on trying to buy some degree of insurance for Iran, preventing a foreign country to attack or invade Iran. Therefore, I believe that the Iranian leadership has made the decision to build the infrastructure, to build the bomb, if they want to build the bomb one day. I think the model that Iran is trying to use is the model of Japan. They want to have the infrastructure, they want to have the knowledge, but I don't believe they have made the decision to weaponize. At this time, if your question is about the next 5 years, preventing there is no regime change, I would say the chances are very high probability that Iran is going to have that capability.
But do you agree that they'll stop before that? I mean, before weaponization and actual deployment?
That, I think, depends on how the negotiations with the U.S. I think the Islamic Republic has shown, as was reported in the National Intelligence Estimate in 2007, they make their decision based on cost and benefit. If they conclude that the price of weaponization is destruction of Iran or destruction of part of Iran or complete isolation or regime change, I think they're going to probably reverse their decision. I don't believe they have made the decision to weaponize yet. They have made the decision, I believe, to develop the infrastructure. And there is a huge difference between developing the infrastructure, having the knowledge, and weaponizing. Huge difference. And I think that's why diplomacy can still work. And I hope that diplomacy can work.
Let me press you on that. Do you mean that diplomacy can still work because it can keep them from even getting to there, or it can keep them stalled before weaponization but having the capacity to weaponize at will?
I would say definitely from the weaponization and less likely from the first part.
And you?
Well, I think there are a couple points to make. One is that diplomacy can stall, it can give rise to other voices, it can create opportunities for a sort of step back and reconsideration of, as Mohsen says, the costs and the benefits. But we also have to recognize this isn't simply a kind of turnkey program at this stage. There are thousands of centrifuges operating, uranium being enriched, but there are multiple other phases to a program that you would need before you actually both have the fissionable material and the capacity to weaponize. So this is the time frame to have some capacity is short. The ability to have a working nuclear weapon, I think most people believe, is much, much longer. And there is a much greater capacity over a 5 or 10 year time frame to influence elites, to influence Iran's perceptions of its own security, and frankly for events in the region to have that influence as they have over the past 10 years. So I think we have a lot of opportunities, but we won't have those opportunities if we tie our hands behind our backs in the way that we did during the Bush administration.
Okay, let's take a couple of questions over here, and I'll bundle one with over here too. So you first, and then back there.
Hi. Thank you. As an Iranian, I would like to see a regime change and the end of the Islamic Republic. And my concern is that 30 years has passed, and we Iranians haven't been able to become united and find a leader, a democratic leader that we can look up to. The possibility of finding a leader in Iran is very hard because the regime doesn't allow the environment. I would like to ask your opinion if we could form a platform to find a leader, to find a way to take a lot of uncertainties out of it, because I think Iranians are willing to have another revolution if they know what they get at the end, if they know who is going to become the leader and what constitution is going to replace it. But they're not willing to have another revolution and pay a lot of blood and something worse replace it.
Okay, and then over here, yes. Back there, a few rows back. Yeah.
Thank you, Colette Mazzucchelli, New York University, for Professor Milani. Your reference to the Japanese model, wouldn't you argue in a sense that even in the Japanese case, there's a lot of internal debate now about how Japan should be reacting on the security front, and that the internal cleavages, in fact, make what you're suggesting for Iran a very, very risky proposition in terms of, the possibility to acquire a bomb given certain circumstances in the region.
Okay, you guys can handle both those.
First question, I just wish you good luck. I am not a political activist. I try to be an analyst, and there is a distinction between an analyst and an activist. An activist can easily change facts because it serves the purpose of a higher purpose. I don't have that. I call them as I see them. Sometimes it hurts, sometimes it doesn't. But I can tell you one thing, that you don't find a leader. A leader emerges. It is not something that you can say, okay, Milani, why don't you become a leader? A leadership emerges because of the struggle of that leader. And at this time, I simply don't see any Iranian leader capable of doing the kind of unification that Ayatollah Khomeini did. Now, no one class, no one group alone can overthrow a well-entrenched regime such as the Islamic Republic. It requires a national coalition. One of the reasons why I think this movement that started a month ago did not really pose a great threat to the Islamic Republic was because it never reached the bazaar, the merchants, the working class, and the lower classes. And that's why, to your excellent question at the beginning, I said Ayatollah Khomeini intervened because he was very concerned about the movement metastasizing into other classes. So at this time, I simply don't see a leader that can unify the opposition. But 2 months from now, a year from now, if you ask that question, maybe I'm going to have a different answer. And regarding Japan, I agree with you. There is a great deal of internal debates in Iran. And one of the reasons why you see this cleavage in Iran today is because of two different views of what Iran should do with its nuclear program. Rafsanjani and Khatami and Mousavi, even if they have the same view regarding enrichment, but I think they are much more willing to compromise with the West than Ahmadinejad and Ayatollah Khomeini is.
You want to add to either of those? Or?
I would just say, as a good scholar, I get much of my information from taxi cab drivers. And actually, a taxi driver in Washington, an Iranian expat in Washington, once told me that Iran has many dissidents and no opposition leaders. And it was a distinction I hadn't really thought of before, comparing it with the Soviet Union. And I think that is one of the difficulties. There are so many people who suffered in Iranian prisons, and many of whom have now come to the United States. Akbar Ganji, Foreign Affairs plug, is one of the most noted and deservedly so. But there are not at this stage people who have the tactical capacity and who are willing to put it to use on behalf of an opposition movement. There are tacticians who've been involved with the reform movement. Many of those are now in prison. I would expect they'll come out with a very different perspective on how they might want to affect political change. And so they may be the sort of foot soldiers of an opposition strategic movement. But you still do need a leader. You need someone who can coalesce people, who gives people that confidence to go to the streets. Mousavi was important. And I think it, interesting historically in his decision to defy the edict of Ayatollah Khamenei. I don't see him as the likely candidate for that leader. He may yet be that person. And there may be those who actually come to the fore either through suffering, through their time in prison, or through their willingness in the Iranian political system to defect, to say, enough is enough, and I'm going to be the person. There are many who hope that Rafsanjani will do that tomorrow. I don't expect that he will, but I do think at some point that leader, as Mohsen said, will emerge. And as to the Islamic Japan, the Iranian desire to follow a Japanese model, I think your question gets to exactly why that is not a very soothing notion for many outside Iran. That turnkey capacity in a country that has such schisms, that has different views, and that clearly has a very radical tendency among its leadership is deeply disturbing and probably would not be acceptable to many of our allies.
Okay, we started a little bit late, so we'll end a little bit late too. We're going to have one more pair of questions here Here and then here. Yes. So you first and then you. No, one in front of you. Yes. Emily?
Hi. Darius Vahabzadeh, former Iranian citizen, product of the 79 revolution. I immigrated here as a result of it. My question is more of a comment with my humble opinion as well as a question followed up.
We call that a council question.
I guess. I don't claim to be a scholar on that subject, but I hear all this speaking about there's a lack of leadership there to replace any kind of reform movement. But I have to imagine the people who are looking to these three reformist leaders, Rafsanjani, Khatami, and Mousavi, I have to imagine to some degree 3 empty chairs, just like right up there, with their names sitting gold-plated on them, just empty chairs though. And I say empty because there's really, as she was saying, there's no viable environment for someone, a reformist, to take that chair and speak out loudly, given the personal security concerns and no other legal or political channels to take recourse if something should happen against them. My question, feel free to disagree with that. My question is, given the schism from above, internally in the halls of power and from the population as a whole, there has to be certain political advantages formulating, coming about, opportunities. What might those opportunities be for political leaders, say for Rafsanjani, but more importantly for, say, Ahmadinejad? He's an insider. He might see some opportunities there. I don't think he's ultimately very pro-cleric, and I think he might be more looking out for himself and potentially gaining more power in this struggle, given I've read somewhere he's got the Revolutionary Guard and Basij in his pocket. What might he possibly want to do with this?
Okay. And the last question right here. Yes. 1 second. Let's wait for the microphone. If you could pass the microphone forward. Right behind you. No, right behind.
I don't think I need it.
Well, but unfortunately, everybody else behind you needs to hear it too.
My name is Stuart Eisler, a retired attorney. A very basic, simple question. I kind of, in my amateurish way, kind of get the feeling that Khomeini did not have a choice, that he had to go along with the wishes of the young generation, the Revolutionary Guard, and the other military forces that want to, in my amateurish way, want a more restrictive society. And is it possible that we're seeing a passing of the Guard from the older generation of religious leaders to a younger generation of restrictive people who do not want the beginnings of a democratic society?
Okay, it's actually 2 very good questions about actors who play a role that we haven't touched on, Ahmadinejad and the younger military leadership in the Revolutionary Guards. Address these, and are there any other actors and any final comments you want to throw in? Alphonse and Gaston.
The easy one goes for you. Go ahead.
Either one. Go.
Either one. You want me to go? I think the question you asked is an excellent one. And I think because you really touched what is behind this electoral dispute. On the one hand, you have a lot of people under the age of 30. 60% of the Iranian population is under the age of 30. And if you look at the faces of the brave demonstrators in Iran, you see that they're mostly young people. So the young generation under the 30, this is the generation that was born after the Islamic Revolution of 1979, does not remember what happened in Iran prior to 1979, is really behind this reform movement. And one of the reasons why I said we have not seen the end of it, and this is not about to die, is because demography is destiny. And demography in Iran is with the younger generation. Having said that, on the other side, there is a new generation of Iranians that are now in power. And it symbolizes Ahmadinejad. These are the people in their 50s. These are the people who fought in the war against Iraq for 8 years. And they are now in control of the major institutions of the Islamic Republic of Iran. They are in charge of the government more or less today. They run the Revolutionary Guards. They run the Basijis. So in many ways, you're seeing a generational struggle. And I think this is going to continue. Now, regarding the first question about the 3 empty chairs, if I have any advice for President Ahmadinejad, I'm going to keep it to myself. And I'm not going to say what he has to do or he shouldn't do. I don't want to give him any additional advantage. I really can't tell you what is going to happen. All I can tell you is that I'm not going to say anything with certainty. Iran has entered into an uncharted territory, and you need to watch what is taking place behind the scene as much as you need to focus on what is taking in the streets of Tehran. The mass media in this country is much more interested in the streets. I'm much more interested in what is going on behind the scene. So be ready for a lot of wonderful things taking place in the next year or two. And by the way, this is why I don't want to tell you what's going to happen, so that the gentleman here can invite me back again so I can tell you about it.
Suzanne, last thoughts.
Well, you get it, a couple of very important things. One is the personality of Ahmadinejad himself, and I think he makes himself such an easy figure for us to make fun of on this end. He's the first Iranian president that I can recall who became a recurring figure on Saturday Night Live. And yet, we shouldn't underrate him. He's got political skills. As Mohsen said earlier, he has a constituency in the population who still, even after double-digit inflation that is largely attributable at this stage to his very foolish economic policies, he still had a very strong base among some constituency within the country, often poor, but not always. So he is someone with real skills. He came to office with no national experience, with no profile, with no sort of coterie of officials whom he had served with and been surrounded by for his entire career, and yet managed to make himself relevant on every political issue in Iran, both domestic and foreign, even when he had no authority. So I think we should not underrate him in terms of his ability to maneuver. That said, I don't think if the implication of your question is he somehow going to shove Khamenei and the clerics off the scene, I don't think that's likely. I think to that extent, the system is well institutionalized enough to withstand even a sort of upstart of the talent and drama of Ahmadinejad. But we should watch him closely. He can do unpredictable things, as he has done in Iran, occasionally embrace liberal positions, even push the envelope on relations with the U.S. The letters, the rambling, sort of crazy letters that he wrote to President Bush and slightly edited version that he wrote to President Obama represented actually a step forward for an Iranian leadership that has been unwilling to directly deal with the great Satan. So don't count him out and recognize that he will be unpredictable. And this whole question of generational change is fascinating and important, and frankly should be of as much concern to the reform movement as it is to the conservatives. The conservatives in many ways are making that transition. They've had Ahmadinejad and even younger. One of his cabinet officials was in his 20s, now runs Iran's largest automaker. So they've had a sort of generational change among the conservatives. The reformists are still, as you saw from their presidential candidates, Mir Hossein Mousavi, the prime minister 20 years ago, the other who should have been one of your empty chairs, Mehdi Karoubi, who is one of the de facto leaders of the opposition at this point, the other reformist candidate who lost, is a septuagenarian cleric who feels the election was stolen for him back in 2005. And since that time has set about creating a political party, a newspaper, and taking on Ahmadinejad in a way that almost no other political figure in the Islamic Republic establishment did. But what we haven't seen among the reformists, we have a lot of tacticians, a lot of activists who are younger. We haven't seen that leadership shift to a second generation, and I think that's going to be critical for what comes of an opposition movement, because clearly the reformists' constituency has been radicalized and looking to move Iran in a new direction.
I want to thank Suzanne and Mohsen. This is Foreign Affairs. As the woman in the biblical story says, these are my jewels. This is what we wanted. This is what we got. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank all of you for coming. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you for watching this Council on Foreign Relations video. For additional audio, video, and transcripts of CFR meetings, as well as expert analysis of international news, please visit us online at cfr.org.